Welcome back to Health Bulletin. Just some time back, Saudi Arabia hosted the 4th Riyadh International Humanitarian Forum. At this event, global leaders, including Dr. Tedros, Director General of the World Health Organization, came together to address some of the world's most pressing humanitarian challenges. But why does this forum matter? Well, over 300 million people worldwide are in need of humanitarian aid. This forum is a crucial platform for discussing real-world solutions to conflicts, climate change, and health crises. It's a call to action for global solidarity and innovation. Dr. Tedros is emphasizing the urgent need for equitable access to healthcare and stronger international cooperation to tackle crises like pandemics, famine, and displacement. Listen to what world leaders have to say.
Okay, but it does sound, though, that because of the complex nature that we're seeing with crises and yes, the disregard for international human law, which we will look at in a few moments, it sounds to me as if all of you have been tested. You've had to improvise in ways to fulfill the humanitarian brief. Is that a fair summation? Who wants to respond to that?
Of course, it is being tested, but you know, we cannot give up. I mean, I think it's a universal framework. We all subscribe to, all members of the United Nations. So we've invested a lot in advocacy, but also in monitoring of international humanitarian law. So we established an independent mechanism of fact-checking and monitoring to give us the full picture. And we can draw on those findings in our advocacy efforts.
Okay then, let's look at this point. Sorry, did you want to add to that, Amy? No, I thought you wanted to, I beg your pardon. But look, I want to look at the law. Now, it has been referenced, but in specifically international humanitarian law. Pierre, this is where you come in. I haven't forgotten you, by the way. But look, we know that IHL is often challenged, and we've seen this in very protracted conflicts like Sudan. So my point to you is, what are the most pressing IHL violations that you are seeing in today's conflicts? I also want to look at accountability, but let's start with that point first, and then we can move on to accountability.
Thank you very much. And first of all, also thank you to Dr. Rabia and the King Salman Center for hosting us and welcoming us in the kingdom. You know, after working for 30 years in armed conflict situations, the first thing that comes to my mind is that we as human beings behave far too casually when it comes to armed conflicts. The impact of all of the wars that are currently taking place, and we have currently about 120 on the planet, is very, very difficult to describe. Because wars, sometimes despite all the coverage in televisions and on the reporting, is very difficult to render in human terms. It's this moment where somebody knocks at your door and tells you that the last time your brother or sister was seen was when he or she was pushed into an unmarked vehicle and sped away, and you might spend the next years without any knowledge of where he or she is. There's so many different forms that armed conflict takes. And in relation to your question on international humanitarian law, we see currently extensive abusive and violations, far too permissive interpretations. If what has happened in recent months in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, in Myanmar, but also over the years in Afghanistan and Sudan and Somalia is reconcilable with proper respect of international humanitarian law, then I can understand why many younger generations ask us, if what I have seen in Gaza is compatible with IHL, then why should I be interested in IHL? But why was international humanitarian law actually first established? Precisely because we know that left alone, human beings are capable of limitless violence against other human beings. This is fully documented. We have seen it across wars. So we need rules in times of war to protect civilians, to better protect prisoners from being tortured, to better protect men and women, but also to deal with new challenges on the horizon, which are the artificial intelligence and new technologies applicable in armed conflicts. So this is what we have to call for, and we really have to remobilize around international humanitarian law. It's not something abstract, it's very concrete, it can save lives and make a difference, But we should spend less time worrying about whether the rules are appropriate and spend more time focusing on their proper implementation. And here I have to say that I find that states can do better. Why? Because we often spend more time criticizing the side in a conflict over which we have no influence, rather than telling our friends that we are closest to that they should behave better. And this form of dialogue is absolutely essential. And a final word to get on this. The other point that we need is we need a rediscovery of the value of mediation. And I really have to recognize here the efforts and investment made by the Kingdom in terms of mediation on Sudan, on the role played now on the Ukraine and Russia conflict. Why? Because as human beings we often behave as if wars were inevitable. But as humanitarian organizations and our partners in the Red Cross and Red Crescent family, we can tell you that every single day our colleagues are on the front lines to see the extensive human suffering that these wars create. And we cannot reconcile ourselves. In fact, we should be indignated at these endless wars that are happening, and we have to call for a resurgence of political action and mediation to prevent wars or to resolve them.
Yeah, I get that point about using mediation to prevent or resolve, but can mediation in any way strengthen the concept of accountability when those international human laws have been violated? Because you're absolutely right. If you have been the victim of a legal violation, okay, either because you've been on the receiving end of it yourself directly or somebody you know has been destroyed, there is no accountability. Why would you believe in the law? Why should you feel that some process of mediation or an alternative can somehow restore your faith, dispel the cynicism?
Well, accountability is absolutely essential. That is correct. We know that in the international system... But
is it sometimes missing? That's the point.
Oh, it's clearly a missing link in the international system. And that's why people tend to be sometimes cynical.
Could I just say as well, because Dr. Tedros just said that it's not even there, which is a fair point, because there does appear to be that absence.
Yes, and we know that that is something that is absent because the community of states has not wished to have those mechanisms enforced more clearly. That is a missing link. But that doesn't change the fact that there's a lot more that can be done. That's not an excuse for states not to mobilize with their partners and friends, other friendly states, to say that the international rules have to be better respected. Let us not look for too many excuses. Yes, the system can be strengthened. International humanitarian law could be strengthened. But if already applied in good faith or in better faith today, many more lives would be saved. And I can say, on the path to resumption of dialogue between states and parties that are involved in conflict, if you have better respected the prisoners of the other, it will pave a better way back to resuming dialogue. You know, I'm struck that in today's world it seems like we're describing political courage as being to say that I will not talk to the other side. My experience of political courage is precisely that we use diplomacy to talk to the side we disagree with in order to bring about solutions.
Dr. Arabia, come back into this, because just following on from that, this idea about accountability and the attacks on international human law must make it extremely difficult for humanitarians, because you're trying to uphold the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, etc., and yet the law is somehow being violated before your very eyes, and it causes difficulties when you're trying to create that middle pathway. So, I mean, how does that, if you like, challenge the position of maintaining the integrity of international diplomacy and making sure that those principles that you abide by have some meaning in conflict settings?
Well, Juliet, the more I hear my colleagues, the more I see the challenge, and I can hear it from your voice. I think humanitarian diplomacy, let's talk about those principles first. The principles of humanity, first of all, what is humanity? Humanity means that you have to decrease the suffering of those who are either under the stress of crisis or in need, and also setting up the priority and having a rapid response. This is easier said than done, because the challenges that we have heard are more difficult than we can imagine. And in order to implement the international humanitarian law, I think you need to build up a trust, both parties. Usually there is one side which is not following or implementing the international humanitarian law, and the duty of humanitarian actors to build up the trust. Once you build up the trust, and whether you do it through the communities or by the influencers and in tribal areas by connecting with the tribe leaders, that will probably pave the way for politicians to reach more longer lasting political solution. Now, for us humanitarian actors, we have also challenges. We have seen it in many countries. First of all, the diversion of aid, whether it goes to civilians or to combatants. Are there any political agendas? And let me warn humanitarian actors, especially international ones. Most of international humanitarian organizations depend on local employees. And we have seen that in many countries. We've seen it in Yemen and many other areas. Most of those local workers have a political agenda. So this, in effect, will actually affect the international NGO political motivation, and they don't know it. So we have always warned about how international NGO local workers may influence the political agenda and will affect also the aim of implementing the international humanitarian law. And also we have to ensure that all of the aid has no political agenda, no religious, no race, no color. That's the aim. In reality, it's not happening. And that's why we have to look at other avenues. I just want to elaborate on going around it. In Yemen, we have circumstances where Taiz, a few years ago, was completely under siege. So how can you cross that siege? And sometimes you have to go to innovation and using even sometimes which is something which is primitive. We have to deliver, and Dr. Tedros knows this, oxygen cylinders to Taiz. The only way to get them through is to use camels and monkeys through the mountains to get through it. That's primitive, but that's going around.
It's another form of innovation, basically.
Yeah. So I want to conclude by ensuring that if we want to be realistic, our humanitarian action should be really without any motivation and any agenda. If that's the case, then we will build up the trust. If you build up the trust, you will be able to go to the negotiation.
I mean, just picking up on the point of trust, Dr. Tedros, yes, I mean, there is cynicism, I understand that, okay, but I wouldn't call it cynicism, I would say it's being honest about the challenges and where things fall short, and at least there is an effort to really look at this and find ways of tackling the issues. But can you share examples where you have seen successful humanitarian diplomacy efforts where humanitarian access has been enhanced along with strength and protection, not just for aid staff, but also affected communities? Because presumably, trust has been a real driver in getting a satisfactory end result.
Yeah, no, thank you. First, just a few words about the attacks on humanitarians. In terms of the attacks on health facilities, we have documented more than 1,500 attacks in 2024 alone, and more than 900 deaths and more than 1,500 injuries. This is big, and sometimes even deliberately targeting health institutions. And that's why the accountability is very important, because it's becoming now a norm. And you see it in all conflict areas. You see it in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. So the accountability is key. And last year, there was a recommendation from WHO and partners, relevant organizations, to ensure or to work on the accountability arm. So I hope that will bring us some result. Then on the examples, I think there are many examples. I think one of them was said already. The polio vaccination in Gaza is one good example. Maybe one thing that I can share with you, and I was part of, is in Syria, especially during the earthquake. I think when there is earthquake, I mean a serious humanitarian issue, sometimes people who don't even talk to each other come together. And what happened was, during the earthquake in Aleppo is one of the affected, we wanted to move supplies to Aleppo. And then there was difficulty finding aircraft and so on, a cargo. We found one which is a Dubai-based cargo. And as you know, we have a logistics hub in Dubai. So the aircraft we found is a Russian Antonov. And I didn't know until we boarded that all the crew of this Russian aircraft Antonov were Ukrainians, all of them. And then it's departing from Dubai to Aleppo. Normally, if you're crossing to Syria, you should go through Damascus, no direct Aleppo flights. But it was granted at that time, and then it flew directly from Dubai to Aleppo because it was a time-sensitive issue. So at that time, of course, President Bashir agreed, and it's within few days everything came together. And that operation brought people who don't even talk to each other. This is one good example. When there is a problem and people are dying and time is the essence, I think people should focus on saving lives rather than their own issues. But that's one example. And then, of course, the cross-border in Syria, be it Bab al-Hawa or Bab al-Salam, where from negotiation through the UN agencies, Idlib, especially the northwest, which had problems to humanitarian support, was getting the necessary support. So that's another example. But I can give you many examples. For instance, DRC, Ebola from 2018 to 2020. Our colleagues, by the way, when we say negotiation, we talk about high level normally, but it has to be devolved. A very junior colleague from WHO negotiated with rebel groups in North Kivu to follow Ebola suspected cases. They allowed her into their territory. And it was fascinating for us when this junior person negotiated, and they allowed her not only to vaccinate the contacts, but some of the contacts were from the rebel group. They also welcomed to be vaccinated. And of course, the reason I'm raising also the DRC issue is not only mediation can be done not only at high level, but at grassroots
the junior level.
Exactly.
And perhaps in some ways the junior was the best because they were seen as unencumbered.
Exactly, can do the best. And they did what they wanted, and the operation was complete. And in DRC at that time, Ebola could not have been contained if these colleagues, junior colleagues, negotiated and had access to the rebel controlled areas.
So things could have been a lot worse. But look, that's a very powerful example, and thank you so much for sharing that. I want to broaden things out, and we're going to have to move fairly quickly because I'm conscious that the clock is ticking very loudly. But I want to look at sanctions, again, the existential and the impact they can have on the ground. I want you to answer this question, Patricia Danzi, and I want to put the same question but phrased slightly differently to you, Maciej, because look, we know that sanctions, they're punitive and perhaps they're seen as a way of controlling behaviour. But on the other hand, if you are a donor, how can you be sure, or what guarantees can you have, that whatever money that you're giving, yes, it's given in good faith, but it might not get caught up in the sanctions line, so to speak, because it's not criminal money, it's there to do good.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, sanctions is a bit of a last resort when trust has been lost or when the legal frameworks are not respected. For a small country like Switzerland, sanctions, we don't have our own sanction regime. We take sanctions either from the UN or from the European Union, and then we decide if we take them or not take them on. Important is to immediately clarify where are the exceptions. Humanitarian aid and humanitarian work should be global, should be neutral, should be impartial, and should reach the communities that are most in need. So we as a country, we negotiate in the forums, be it at the Security Council or elsewhere, the exceptions for the sanctions, either internationally but also domestically. Because what we observe as a donor is that some of the partners are fast in actually trying to comply with sanctions. And then you get complicated issues in terms of the banking systems, the partners not being able to access and not being able to transfer the goods, the money that is needed. So it's very important also at a certain level of time after to honestly see, did the sanctions actually work? Did they have the intended outcome in terms of access, in terms of compliance, in terms of other things? And if not, maybe review them as well.
Let me bring you in, Maciej Popowski, because look, I mean, Patricia mentioned the word there, compliance, and I know that compliance is very, very complex. Some of it is reflexive, responding to a situation as and when it arises. So realistically, is it possible to insulate humanitarian funds from sanctions and the punitive side effects that they create? Because again, there is that danger that if the money doesn't reach the intended, it feeds the anger, the bitterness, this sense of abandonment. So how can you really insulate humanitarian funds when you've got different players imposing sanctions left, right and centre?
Well, first of all, sanctions are part of a broader toolbox. And of course, sanctions are supposed to bite, but they are supposed to bite the wrong guys, not the innocent people. So we already look at the unintended consequences at the inception phase when we define the scope of sanctions. And indeed, that's also the moment to introduce elements of a humanitarian exemption. And we do it always, it's an evidence-based process. Huh? We look at the legal consequences, but also at the available evidence. So sanctions have to be targeted. And there's always specific provisions accepting food, medicine, emergency aid. Of course, since the adoption of the general UN resolutions on humanitarian sanctions exemption, we've been really pushing hard to obtain them. Sometimes it's a temporary exemption, sometimes a permanent one, most of the time a temporary, but it helps a lot. Indeed, Patricia mentioned the overcompliance, which is pretty well, pretty common, and it mainly concerns the banking sector. So it's so in order to facilitate, to make life easier of the humanitarian operators, we also provide some guidance through our people in the field. We have established a humanitarian contact point, central contact point, providing guidance on EU sanctions, because there are several layers: UN, autonomous UN, EU sanctions, and then US sanctions and other regimes. So we always in a dialogue, and whenever the situation allows for it, we would go for suspension, and that was the latest case with Syria. So after the fall of the regime, when we reached out to the new authorities. And by the way, we as a humanitarian organization, we had some kind of relationship with them, because we worked with the HTS when they were in Idlib, providing humanitarian aid from Gaziantep in Turkey. So the EU member states decided to temporarily suspend EU sanctions on Syria. Some technical work is still ongoing, and there will be a snapback mechanism, but it should facilitate things. I can conclude by giving you one specific example how things can get complicated on the ground. When I was in Syria in May of last year, I went to the Hama province and visited a water treatment plant, and we co-financed its refurbishment. And then I was told by the manager that the main issue for them is to buy chlorine to treat water. And chlorine is a dual-use good. You can use it to build a chemical weapon. So getting clearance for that was quite a tall order. So that kind of difficulties should hopefully disappear at some point. Thank you.
Okay, then thank you so much for that. But I mean, look, well, I suppose it is an allusion to the water analogy, the trickle-down effect, because my point to you, Amy Pope, is that when there are sanctions, yes, great efforts can be made to prevent the dirty money, if you like, actually making its way into legitimate causes. But at the same time, it is a challenge if a country is under sanction, because you want to establish and indeed sustain dialogue with the conflict parties, international organisations and NGOs, because again, what is at stake here is humanitarian access. And I need to know from you how you circumvent that. It's hard work, I know, but I mean, I'm sorry, I feel as if I'm sort of throwing the worst of the questions at you. I do apologise.
You might be, it's all right.
Sorry.
I want to broaden it a little bit beyond the sanctions question, because I think that it's a broader question of how we engage effectively, especially at this moment in time. And I had the chance to go into Gaza on Thursday. I was there with our humanitarian coordinator, Mohamed Hadi, who's with us today. And you see firsthand that dynamic play out. How do we coordinate effectively? How do we establish dialogue with the communities we're trying to serve? How do we establish dialogue with the conflicting parties? And I think there are kind of three pieces, if I could lay out, that I think we need to address. And the first is just logistical or bureaucratic, because that is so often an impediment to the work we're able to do. Whether you can get a visa, whether you can get access, whether you can get the proper security, whether the supply chain is working. All of those things can undermine your ability to create a dialogue that persuades parties that you're there to serve people. And every single piece of that can be quite fraught with political tensions and with misunderstanding. The second piece, though, is the erosion of trust. And we're seeing the erosion of trust accelerate at rates I think no one really anticipated. And it's fueled at one part by misinformation about who we are, about what we intend to do. And some of that is deliberate, some of that is being done by conflicting parties, warring parties who want to instrumentalize humanitarian actors. But what we also see is it's happening at a community level, feeding conspiracies about what our role is and what our intent is. And that's something that's quite easily manipulated in this day and age. And the third is I think we sometimes get caught in old ways of doing things. You know, we sometimes use the playbook of the 1950s, but we're in 2025, right? So take a moment to think about how we use communications, what communications tools we use within the humanitarian sector, how we use artificial intelligence, whether we are acting to a community or with a community, right? There's quite a lot of outdated, antiquated ways of doing humanitarian response, and I think sometimes our community has not yet caught up to where we need to be able to effectively engage with the people that we are trying to serve.
Okay, let me put a question to you, Pierre Kirimbol, because you've been sitting there and following everything attentively, so thank you so much. But look, we are living in a world where states and non-state actors are increasingly contesting humanitarian neutrality, okay? There are good people on the stage and less than good people, shall we say. My question to you is, how do you think that organisations like yours can maintain trust and secure operational space in complex conflicts? Because as Amy pointed out there's a lot of disinformation that's going around. And we know, as Dr. Tedros has said, that there are people who have died as a result of that disinformation, okay? Communities themselves, but also the aid workers. What's the pushback?
So the first thing to say about neutrality is that it's one of the most counterintuitive attitudes for any human being. For me, coming out of a prison when the ICRC visits detainees and you see people who have been tortured, or you meet relatives of families of missing persons and you see their despair, the first natural human reflex would be to call a press conference and to denounce and scream your indignation at what you've seen. That's the normal human reflex. So neutrality is something very counterintuitive. And I always say that nobody in the ICRC was born neutral. We all have the heart in the right place. We all have strong personal beliefs. But when we join the organization, we make a conscious choice that to give priority to a neutral position means you're not supporting one or the other side. But why do we do that? We do that because we think that is the better path for access, a point that was raised earlier. So I just came back from Afghanistan, where I spent a week, and the ICRC has been present there for 40 years. That means we have spoken to authorities when they were communists. We have spoken to authorities when they were Mujahideen parties. We have spoken to authorities when they were the Republican government and all international forces were present, and we've spoken to authorities now in the Islamic Emirate. We've also spoken to most of them when they were in opposition, before they came to power. And when you visit the ICRC's physical rehabilitation centers in Afghanistan, where every year 200,000 people who are still today being injured by either landmine explosions or other forms of weapons, you realize that every time you have a doubt about the value of neutrality, that is reconfirmed in its essence as being valuable. And when you spoke about the challenges that we face today, yes, there is active criticism of this neutrality on social media platforms, in political circles. The challenges are very robust, and I think we all feel that we need to find better answers to responding to the social media onslaughts that we sometimes face and the harmful information. I'll be honest, we haven't found all the answers, far from it yet, and we're not sure we will ever find them completely. We'll just have to learn to deal with this. But our best response, because you used the word before, cynicism, skepticism, those two words for me are one of the least sophisticated forms of surrender when you work in the humanitarian field. We don't have the luxury of those kind of words because every day our teams are confronted with the absolute extremes of horror that populations face. And we need to overcome every moment of doubt that we have in order to reach people who are in need and experience these horrors. And so that's where our engagement is, and that is why neutrality matters.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I'd like to really leave the closing words to you, Dr. Al-Rabia, before we close out with the video as well. Because look, we've heard so much. There's no doubt in your commitment, your determination of everybody to make a difference in this upended landscape. But that's the point, isn't it, Dr. Al-Rabia? It is the fact that the world is changing. We don't know how the pieces are going to land. Will humanitarian diplomacy have to change in some way if it is to survive?
Well, thank you, Juliet. I feel what I heard from my colleagues in this podium, that the humanitarian diplomacy and also the essence of international humanitarian law, and we addressed also sanctions and their effect. My key message that now we are in 2025 and we should sit down as a humanitarian actors and revisit what we have done in the last 10 years. What are the rules that has been applied? What are the sanctions that has been applied? And what are the challenges that has met us? And see the success stories and probably expand on them, and see the failures that has come in front of the humanitarian actors and see how can we find intelligent, intellectual solutions for them. And once we bring those data from the past and plan for the future, then sit with the politicians and then see what is their challenges also, those who act heavily in the political solutions, and come up with probably newer recommendations that will succeed in the future.
A positive note on which to end the discussion, but what I would like to do now is to ask you to watch the screen, because we're going to have a pre-recorded video message from Tom Fletcher. He is the Under-Secretary General for the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Thank you.
Dear friends, it's an honour to join you today in celebrating the 10th anniversary of the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Centre. Though I'm not with you in person, and I wish I was, I share your very deep appreciation for KS Relief's remarkable achievements over the past decade, and for its commitment to saving lives, saving the lives of millions in need. This forum comes at a crucial moment. Conflicts are increasing in frequency and intensity. The climate crisis is becoming a major driver of humanitarian needs. Many world leaders are turning their backs on multilateralism, and aid workers are overstretched, underfunded, and literally under attack. That's why today's discussion on humanitarian diplomacy is so timely. In my first 3 months in this job, whether in Darfur, in Damascus, in Kyiv, or in Gaza, I've witnessed firsthand the value of humanitarian diplomacy. It allows us to navigate complex crises, negotiate access in conflict zones, and engage with both state and non-state actors to safeguard humanitarian space. It's a bridge between humanitarian action and political engagement, supporting access, advocating for protection of civilians, and ensuring compliance with international humanitarian law. As humanitarian diplomacy evolves, we must integrate new and innovative approaches, technology, digital tools. The engagement of youth must transform the humanitarian landscape. From early warning systems to AI-driven data analysis, these innovations enhance our ability to predict, prevent, and respond to crises more effectively. Equally, empowering the next generation of humanitarian leaders is essential in ensuring a sustainable and forward-thinking approach to humanitarian action. Leadership is critical to this effort. The Middle East faces some of the most pressing humanitarian challenges, requiring innovative and strategic leadership to address long-running conflicts, protect civilians, and uphold international law. The role of regional powers in shaping humanitarian diplomacy is utterly pivotal, whether in Yemen, Sudan, Syria, Lebanon, or the occupied Palestinian territory. So OCHA values this partnership with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the wider Gulf region, which has long championed humanitarian diplomacy. Together, we must uphold principled humanitarian action and stand up for people in need everywhere. Thank you.
That message was from Tom Fletcher, the Under-Secretary General for the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. That brings this opening panel to a close. Could you please show your appreciation to the panel for their insights, for sharing their time, taking the time up from their very busy schedules.
Subscribe to Health Bulletin now for the latest updates on science and health. Be the first to know about breakthroughs, outbreaks, and life-saving innovations.